Genghis Khan stands amidst a sea of corpses, not as a barbarian warlord, but methodically reviewing scrolls of numbers. The greatest killer in human history isn't counting gold, but people tracking precisely how many millions have died by his command. His generals wait nervously as he calculates the day's slaughter with the cold precision of an accountant. Blood soaks the ground beneath his boots, yet his eyes reveal no emotion, only mathematical satisfaction. The history books call him a conqueror who created trade routes and unified peoples. But they silently omit that this man engineered human extinction on a scale so vast that Earth's climate physically changed. Behind every sanitized museum exhibit and Hollywood epic lies the uncomfortable truth. Civilization embraced the legacy of history's most efficient mass murderer. The opening image is meant to shock. You saw a leader not as legend, but as a ledger, a man who measured lives like coins. That scene does not appear in the textbooks most of us grew up with. Now, before those comfortable pages are pulled apart, let's retell the story the world was taught. Everyone knows the outline. A boy named Temujin is born around 1162 into hardship. His father is poisoned. His tribe fractures. Against those odds he survives. He returns, rallies clans, defeats rivals, and, by the early 13th century, proclaims himself Genghis Khan, universal ruler. Under his banner, the Mongols sweep out of the steppe. They cross mountains and deserts. Their banners meet the walls of cities that had stood for centuries. In a few decades, the largest contiguous land empire in history stretches from the Pacific to the Caspian Sea. This is the rags to empire arc schools compress into a neat hero's journey. Textbooks celebrate the outcomes. They point to the roads and the marketplaces that followed. They give a name to the era, Pax Mongolica. Merchants travel with fewer bandits. Ideas and technologies flow from one capital to another. The cavalry tactics, the decimal organization of troops, the relay stations across the steppe, these are taught as military genius and administrative brilliance. They praise Genghis Khan's practical reforms, a written code, promotion on merit, and a willingness to borrow superior crafts from conquered peoples. In this telling, he was a unifier who brought order to chaos. Imagine those scenes as a schoolroom montage. A map unfurls. A teacher taps the Silk Road with a pointer. A textbook opens to a page where the Mongol is a rugged, enigmatic founder, a necessary violence tempered by governance. Museums follow the script. Gleaming saddles. Elegant metalwork. A carved panel here, a ceremonial garment there. Hollywood trims the rough edges and throws light on the drama, the broken childhood, the battlefield flash, the rise. Economic historians add graphs. Trade volume up, cultural exchange up. The story is tidy. It is reassuring. Voices of the official narrative sound like this. He brought law to the lawless. He broke centuries of internecine war. Another voice, authoritative, states, the Mongol Empire facilitated a global exchange unseen before science, crops, ideas. A third, in a patriotic register, might say, from nomad to emperor, he forged a nation that still inspires the Mongol people. These lines are polished, confident. They close wounds rather than open them. This version is designed to comfort. It smooths wartime disorder into necessary consolidation. It frames brutality as a reluctant instrument toward peace. In that gloss, refugee suffering becomes a footnote. Cultural collapse becomes an unfortunate but necessary clearing of the ground for progress. The narrative's power lies in its coherence. Origins explained, purpose supplied, costs implied but minimized. It answers the central question the audience tends to ask. Why did it happen? The answer offered is tidy: to create stability, to enable trade, to spread civilization. Who benefits from such a tidy origin myth? Empires and successor states, first and foremost. After Genghis Khan died, his children and grandchildren ruled lands that were still raw from conquest. They needed legitimacy. Painting the founder as a lawgiver rather than an exterminator made governance possible. Religious institutions benefited too. A tolerant image of Mongol rule meant fewer rebellions of conscience and more predictable taxation. Later, nation-states and imperial projects co-opted the narrative. Colonial powers looked to the Mongols as precedents for their own civilizing rhetoric. In the 20th century, newly independent Mongolia found in Genghis Khan a unifying symbol. Economies built tours, museums, and memorabilia around him. The market prefers a hero it can package. There is a comfortable coherence to this official story. It fits like a glove. The violence is framed as necessary, the achievements as enduring. It erases the dissonance between the splendid artifacts and the ruined harvests. It woos the listener into agreement with a single, consoling assumption: the ends justify the means. But the version you learned in classrooms leaves out textures that change everything. It omits the reports that describe burning fields, the eyewitness chronicles that name victims and list numbers in terrible detail, the archaeological traces of once dense cities reduced to ghosts. It leaves out the administrative practices that made killing systematic. It ignores the ecological aftershocks. The official tale is not a neutral account. It's a choice. That's the story they taught you, the narrator might say. Now we'll look closer. And when you look closer, you find that the story is too smooth to be true. There are seams. Before we step through them, a quick word. If you've stayed this far into a dense, uncomfortable investigation, thank you. This channel is a small team trying to uncover stories your history class skipped. If you find this kind of deep re-examination valuable, subscribing helps us reach the 1,000 subscriber mark and keep producing work like this. We're building a dossier, one episode at a time. Your subscription makes the next investigation possible. So what does the comfortable myth actually omit? Where does the tidy timeline fray? The next section will map the cracks, starting with numbers that refuse to be ignored and sources that tell a different story. Keep listening. The first fissures appear quickly, and once they open, the official tale no longer holds together. History can be cracked open with arithmetic. It starts with a number someone failed to hide. Historians estimate the world population in the early 13th century at roughly 400 million. It's an imprecise figure. We note the uncertainty. But even allowing for error margins, the casualties attributed to the Mongol campaigns are enormous. Scholars working from chronicles, demographic models, and archaeological evidence have suggested that the Mongol conquests and their cascading effects killed something on the order of 40 million people. That's nearly 10% of humanity at the time. Put simply, a single political military movement may have removed a tenth of the world's population in a few decades. When you hear such a number in a lecture room, it can feel abstract. To make it concrete, imagine every man, woman, and child in a modern nation like France multiplied by 4 gone. Or picture 10 times the population of a large city emptied from the map. Numbers of that magnitude reshape ecosystems, economies, and the very memory of peoples. They don't vanish into statistics. They leave physical scars. This arithmetic raises the first fissure in the official story. How does an empire so praised for creating stability and trade also preside over demographic collapses of this scale? If Pax Mongolica is the banner, what price was paid for it? Where does visionary leader stop and systematic destroyer begin? We start by laying out the sources, because they matter. The official myth relies heavily on later commissioned works, biographies, court histories, state chronicles. These were written by or under the auspices of the Mongol successors, or by their clients. In contrast, contemporaneous accounts from Persian, Chinese, and Arabic chroniclers are often more visceral and less flattering. The Persian historian Javani, for example, recorded the devastation in scenes of depopulated plains and unplowed fields. Chinese annals, written in courts that felt the invasion firsthand, cataloged cities sacked and the refugees who fled. Russian chronicles speak of entire provinces. Those considered economically or militarily useful were spared, enslaved, or relocated. The rest were eliminated. The logic resembles a cold ledger. Useful human capital moved, redundant populations erased. The result was depopulation on an industrial scale. At this point, a reasonable reader asks, are those accounts exaggerated by traumatized chroniclers? Trauma sometimes amplifies horror. Yet multiple independent accounts from distinct cultural sources report consistent patterns: burning, mass graves, abandoned fields, regrown forests. Archaeology corroborates what words describe. Satellite imagery today can detect reforestation where medieval farming once occurred. Pollen records show declines in cereal pollen and increases in tree pollen. In some regions, the drop in land use is consistent with large-scale population loss. These are physical fingerprints. Let's look at the claim of religious tolerance, another pillar of the official narrative. Modern histories often praise the Mongols for allowing multiple faiths under their rule. On the surface, this is true. Christians, Muslims, Buddhists, and animists coexisted in Mongol domains. But context shifts interpretation. Religious tolerance here often functioned as pragmatic administration. If a community is spared because it offers taxes, trade links, or specialists, tolerance becomes a tool, not a virtue. The Khan had little interest in doctrinal liberty for its own sake. The tolerance was efficient. Faiths were allowed to continue so long as they did not impede extraction. This interpretation is supported by dispatches and administrative records. Tax registers and caravan permits matter as much as theological tracts. If a cleric could maintain a hospital that kept laborers healthy, that cleric's religion was tolerated. If an urban elite could be deported and their skills harnessed, they were spared but relocated. The result: cultural continuity sometimes persisted by force through transplantation. Another fissure appears when we examine the supposed meritocracy. The Mongol promotion system did reward skill. Nominally, merit trumped lineage. This is part of the sanitized appeal. A man from the steppe promotes talented administrators regardless of birth. But the meritocratic ideal coexisted with ruthless population control. The same regime that appointed non-Mongols to high office also ordered the deaths of whole villages. That contradiction does not cancel brutality, it sharpens it. Meritocracy here was a means to a greater end: survival and expansion of a military-political apparatus that depended on both ruthless suppression and skilled governance. You could rise if your skills were useful. You and your neighbors could die if you were not. Now consider demographic engineering as a deliberate strategy. Conquerors throughout history have practiced forced relocations. The Mongols institutionalized and regularized this process. Skilled artisans were uprooted from their cities and placed in new workshops under Mongol oversight. Populations were scattered across the empire, breaking ties of memory and resistance. This served several purposes. It depopulated rebellious heartlands, supplied scarce human capital to burgeoning Mongol centers, and diluted ethnic concentrations that might rally against Mongol rule. The effect on cultural continuity is incalculable. Language, trade connections, religious practices, these were altered through displacement. The third block of fissures comes from comparing the ostensible benefits, the safe routes, the trade expansion with the mechanism that produced them. Pax Mongolica was not a spontaneous peace. It was enforced. Imagine a caravan stretching across thousands of miles. It moves because banditry is suppressed. Banditry is suppressed because the penalty for raiding is disproportionate reprisal. The peace enjoyed by merchants in many routes came at the cost of terror in towns that resisted. In practice, the Pax was a consequence of a system that made resistance too costly to consider. That is a different moral calculation than peace achieved by enlightened rule. Another layer to unpack is symbolism and memory. Successor states had political reasons to reframe Genghis Khan as a unifier. The secret history of the Mongols, written after the founder's death, mixes myth, genealogy, and justification. It presents a founder with a divine mandate, a sovereign who turns savagery into order. But commissioned texts are not neutral. They are instruments of statecraft. The transformation of a violent conqueror into a lawgiver is an act of narrative governance, as deliberate as any administrative edict. It smooths over massacres. It creates rituals of loyalty. When exploring the cracks in the official narrative, one must confront another uncomfortable fact. The scale of death had ecological consequences. Scholars have suggested that the depopulation of agricultural lands in parts of Asia allowed forests to regrow, thereby altering carbon sequestration and even contributing to temporary cooling on a hemispheric scale. This is not metaphor. It is a claim based on palynology and climate modeling. Human demographic collapse can have planetary effects. That linkage suggests that the Mongol campaigns were not only socio-political events, but environmental interventions, intentional or otherwise, that changed Earth's systems for decades, perhaps centuries. Sources differ on motives. Some chroniclers present personal slights and vendettas, insulted envoys, broken deals as the sparks for massive reprisals. Others frame the violence as strategic, as a component of a wider plan to impose a new order. Likely both are true. Human decisions are messy, but the pattern is consistent. Small triggers, when wielded by a regime that cultivates terror as policy, yield catastrophic outcomes. Now, let's address a sensitive and often swept under the rug area: the systematic sexual violence of conquest. Modern DNA studies have recovered patterns suggesting that men from the Mongol steppe fathered a disproportionately large number of descendants across Asia. Some of this is likely attributable to power imbalances and the taking of wives and concubines from conquered populations. Chroniclers, too, record episodes of rape and forced redistribution of women. The sanitized narrative that praises women's rights under Mongol law misses the coercive reality of how gendered violence was often part of the conquest apparatus. That violence cannot be divorced from policy when it is repeated in systematic patterns across campaigns. At each step, the official story's neat moral calculus phrase further. Merit-based promotion, religious pluralism, trade, these things happened. They were real, but they emerged within and because of a predatorily efficient system of control. You cannot credit the empire building without accounting for the mechanism that made it possible. Terror employed as a structural instrument. Who wrote the cleaner version and why did it stick? Power rewrites memory. Successor states had incentives to preserve and embellish. Later Western historians, when encountering the Mongol narrative, often filtered it through their own concerns in the Enlightenment and colonial era's admiration for military efficiency, fascination with exotic administration, an inclination to read pragmatic tolerance as progressive. Those intellectual currents further smooth the rough edges. How do we move from contradiction to plausible reconstruction? By triangulating sources and keeping uncertainties explicit. Some claims are broad consensus. The Mongol conquests were extraordinarily lethal and transformative. Other interpretations: precise death tolls, proportional environmental impact, motivations of specific decisions are debated. Good historical work must label what is certain, what is probable, and what remains contested. This investigation does not claim to solve every dispute. It aims to show that the comfortable tale of a reluctant violence that became enlightened governance is incomplete. Consider the following scene to close this block. A Mongol commander receives a report from a reconnaissance unit. The report lists numbers: able-bodied men conscripted, artisans selected for relocation, villages that refuse to surrender. The commander ticks off quotas. Below, cartographers draw new administrative boundaries over an emptied landscape. Couriers carry lists of names to be relocated to other provinces. In another part of the map, a scribe composes a chronicle for the court that speaks of divine right and necessary order. Both scenes are true. Both happen simultaneously. The moral cost is recorded in the local cemetery and in the language clinical. The work felt less like war and more like inventory. You can picture it. A low fire lamplight, the smell of smoked meat, the murmur of translators. Genghis Khan Temujin in private received reports from scouts in an early morning hush. They did not hand him trophies. They handed him ratios. How many bowmakers in this town? How many able-bodied men? How many horses? Commanders reported population densities like harvest yields. He listened. He nodded. Decisions followed the numbers with the inevitability of a metronome. His closest advisors were chosen for utility. They were not all bloodkin or fellow horsemen. Among them were engineers who had sacked other courts and then been spared to work, astronomers who could map routes and calculate distances, scribes fluent in Persian, Chinese, Turkic, and Uyghur. These captured specialists were kept alive because their knowledge increased the empire's returns. In practice, that meant a permanent council of people whose very survival depended on being useful to the conqueror. Siegecraft, logistics, and psychological warfare were not ad hoc. They were taught in training circles and refined as doctrine. Mongol units sent ahead of an assault carried a standard warning: surrender, and some lives will be spared. Resist, and everyone will die. Messengers delivered this message as if handing over a contract. The choice was framed as simple and immediate. It worked. The optics were cruel but efficient. When a city opened its gates, craftsmen often walked out alive, in chains but alive. When it did not, the accounts that followed recorded blank spaces where entire neighborhoods had been. There was record-keeping after victories as well. Census takers trailed the armies. They logged skills and ages. They tallied the men who could be conscripted and the women who could be taken for households or breeders, according to the perverse logic of the time. The states separated human capital into categories: soldiers for recruitment, artisans for transplant, agricultural laborers for taxation, and the rest for elimination. This system turned violence into supply chain management. The practice of forced relocation was systematic and calculated. Skilled craftsmen from Nishapur or Samarkand were not simply enslaved, they were reassigned. An expert weaver might find himself 20 days' ride away, under new masters, producing cloth for Mongol courts. By breaking communities apart, the empire severed lines of resistance. Memory and local leadership were dissolved not merely by killing, but by scattering. Families who survived owed their survival to usefulness, not mercy. Women's experiences expose a particularly brutal strand of this system. Contemporary chronicles and modern genetic studies together paint a difficult picture. Chroniclers wrote of the mass taking of women as spoils, of households reconfigured by force. Centuries later, genetics shows the echoes. Regions across Central and Western Asia have lineages that appear to descend disproportionately from men of the steppe. This biological footprint is not a neutral fact. It is evidence of intimate violence deployed as policy. Where some modern narratives point to rights for women under Mongol law, the cold reality of conquest often included sexual violence as a tool. Displacement, humiliation, integration, and domination rolled into one deliberate act. This bureaucratic cruelty had rituals. After a sack, white-clothed clerks would sit amid rubble and write down names, professions, quantities. Engineers would level the remains of a wall, count bricks, earmark the salvageable metal. Couriers would carry lists to other provinces, like orders for labor. The conqueror's gaze never left the ledger. People became entries. Resistance became surplus to be culled. Efficiency, not fury, was the motive given in the margins. And yet, this efficient cruelty required obedience from subordinates who were not always comfortable with it. There were hesitations. Commanders sometimes argued over who to spare and who to execute. A talented smith might be spared and his neighbor killed anyway. These were choices made under constraints and incentives, not blind hatred. The moral texture here is complex. Survival and usefulness were the currency that bought life. That calculus produced emerging elites who understood that collaboration could protect them and that non-compliance could erase them. From the outside, the empire presented order. Roads were cleared. Caravans moved without fear of bandits. Cities that cooperated had markets and registers. But inside the ledger, the cost of that order was explicit. The peace came at the price of erasure. That is the part missing in the postcards and the statues. It is the part that cannot be fully reconstituted by plaques and labels in museums. Before the light moves on, there is a final, quieter detail. The Mongol army kept lists of people it wanted transferred: engineers for bridges, doctors for courts, potters for ateliers. These lists were not just practical. They were the blueprint of a new demographic map, drawn with the same hand that signed annihilation orders. The two acts, extraction and extermination, were complementary lines on the same page. If you learned the story as a march of inevitable victories, you missed the ledger. If you saw the silk banners and thought of a unifier, you did not see the names removed from the rolls. And if you believed the tolerance so often praised was a moral stance, consider that it often looked like pragmatic neutrality. Religions were allowed because they served administration and taxation. That's an uncomfortable kind of toleration. There is one more quiet image to leave with: a scribe, late at night, using a lamp to cross out names in a column. He dips his pen once, twice, until the ink is thick and irreversible. Outside, the wind moves through an unplowed field where children once played. The list is now shorter. The empire's map is cleaner. The reader should feel the weight of that erasure. What follows next is an event where this system was applied with a scale and certainty that shock even experienced chroniclers. Tension had been building for months. Envoys and couriers had crossed deserts and mountains. The Shah of Khwarezm had miscalculated. He executed messengers. The mistake was small in diplomatic terms, but enormous in consequence, because Genghis Khan treated envoys as a test of submission. The steppe leader saw the killing of envoys as either defiance or an opportunity. He chose a response meant to instruct the rest of the world. The Mongol advance into Khwarezm in 1219 moved with a terrible clarity of aim. Scouts carved routes on maps. Columns split to outflank fortified towns. Siege engineers, many of them captives of slower wars, worked methodically. When the Mongols reached the great cities, they did not only fight, they reorganized. Advisors and clerks moved among the rubble, separating hands skilled at certain trades from those they deemed expendable. Those deemed useful were loaded onto pack animals and sent east. The rest were recorded and often killed. Samarkand and Bokhara were centers of learning, craft, and trade. The conquerors' teams cataloged the books, the dyes, the loom patterns, the names of master artisans. They prized knowledge as engines of revenue and capability. Meanwhile, they cleared the city squares with a cruelty that read as both punitive and deliberate. Chronicles of the time do not soften this. One Persian writer watches as fields lie fallow and bones bleach in the sun. Another describes rivers running red. The language is visceral because the scenes were visceral. In Urgench, the accounts grow clinical in their horror. Commanders were said to assign execution quotas. Men were ordered to kill by the hundreds. Satellites of terror were coordinated. Engineers diverted watercourses, funneling floodwaters through neighborhoods to drown survivors. That detail alone, engineers used to kill on a mass scale, changes how the event registers. This was not an unruly mob run amok. This was organized destruction, executed with the applications of tools and knowledge that had nothing to do with chance. The numbers are disputed by modern scholars, and debates about precise totals remain. Historians argue over methodology, source reliability, and extrapolation. But the scale of collapse in some areas is not in doubt. Entire provinces emptied. Graveyards multiplied. The silence of what was once bustling market life is reported in multiple independent accounts. Agricultural cycles were interrupted for generations. In many places, Pollen cores now show a dramatic decline in cereal cultivation and a simultaneous rise in tree pollen. They also inserted administrative nodes, relay stations, military outposts, new centers where artisans served the empire under surveillance. The survivors who remained often did so under new masters and new legal codes. Memory persisted among survivors, but the social fabric that created cities over centuries was shredded. Beyond demographic and cultural loss, the Khwarezmian campaign had ecological reverberations. Some climate models suggest population reductions on the scale caused by Mongol campaigns could have temporarily reduced carbon emissions enough to influence regional and perhaps hemispheric temperature trends. Palynological evidence, the study of pollen and sediment layers, supports the narrative of farmland abandonment and reforestation in certain regions. If these models are correct, the effects of human violence reached beyond culture and economy into atmosphere nonetheless. These modeling results remain debated and probabilistic, not absolute proof. The point is not to claim definitive climate causation, but to show how human-scale violence can leave signatures readable in tree rings and peat bogs. There is also an ethical and psychological dimension to consider. For survivors, the choice to collaborate was rarely ideological. It was survival calculus. For the empire, the policy achieved behavioral control. News of total destruction traveled faster than diplomacy. You didn't need to send another army. A reputation preceded you. Merchants might prefer secure caravan routes and reduced banditry, but that safety was purchased with indiscriminate terror elsewhere. The Pax Mongolica was less a gift bestowed than a condition enforced. In the years that followed, rulers and clerics in Europe, Persia, and China all tried to make sense of the catastrophe. Some framed it as divine punishment, others as military genius. Yet many contemporaneous writers, those who recorded what they saw on the ground, kept returning to a central horror, the thoroughness. Centuries later, inscription and archaeology confirm that organized killing on this scale left long-term blanks on the map. The catastrophe raises an unavoidable question: how does deliberate annihilation feed into governance? The answer is structural. An empire that practices such eradication crafts institutions designed to monitor and categorize human life. Once census taking and forced relocation are normalized, they fold naturally into tax systems, labor allocation, and military recruitment. The same hand that orders death also writes ledgers for administration. The terrifying logic is internal. A system that values efficiency will adopt measures that maximize resource extraction and minimize the cost of rebellion, sometimes by removing bodies altogether. After Khwarezm, the Mongol state did not simply boast of victory. It created new administrative mechanisms to exploit what remained. Governors were appointed in cities now partially depopulated. Trade privileges were extended to merchants who carried Mongol passports. Religious officials were integrated when convenient. The empire's face softened in policy documents, while the ledger behind the scenes remained stark. The spectacle of mercy in some places served to obscure the ledger in others. The story of Khwarezm is therefore not merely a record of destruction. It is the demonstration case for a system that made death a functional instrument of policy. And it forces a difficult reckoning. How did posterity come to celebrate an architect of such methods? That question travels with us into the archives of mythos, where rebranding begins almost as soon as the guns fall silent. The next chapter is the deliberate act of reimagining a campaign not of conquest, but of narrative. How do successors, chroniclers, and later cultures clean the ledger, stitch a new story over the blanks, and make sure the public remembers victory rather than vacuum? The answer lies in a machinery of words, images, and incentives that turned massacre into myth. What happens after conquest is rarely left to chance. The moment an empire faces a fractured population grieving, resentful, bereft of elites, it confronts a legitimacy problem: how to compel obedience without continuous slaughter. The Mongol solution was multiply pragmatic. They used power to govern and narratives to justify that power. The machine that churned out the heroic founder began whirring almost as soon as Genghis Khan breathed his last. Commissioned histories were the first gear. The secret history of the Mongols, compiled in the decades after the founder's death, blends genealogy, myth, and political instruction. It elevates Temujin's origins, frames his acts as destined, and offers a sequence of moral tests that produce rightful rule. The inconvenient details explicit quotas, the scale of civilian deaths, the accounts of drowned towns are either absent or reframed. Where chronicles that remember the dead lament without closure, official biographies provide closure. Order from chaos, violence as necessary forging. Successor rulers had immediate incentives to sanitize the past. They were inheritors of an empire carved by terror. They needed to present continuity, not a criminal record. Kublai Khan and other heirs sought legitimacy in local registers. They adopted the language of Confucian administration in China, patronized religious scholars in Persia, and employed local elites who could stitch Mongol rule into familiar frames. When a new dynasty needs to rule over diverse subjects, a hero with lawgiver's credentials is a much safer ancestor than an exterminator with a ledger. The artisans of memory were not only imperial scribes. They included painters, architects, and storytellers who produced images easier to consume than corpses cleaved on the steppe. Temples were commissioned, inscriptions carved, coins minted. A statue is more persuasive than a field of stumps. Over time, these artifacts accumulated into a coherent image, a unifier, a lawgiver, a man who adopted foreign techniques and valued merit. Outside the empire, interpretations by scholars and intellectuals further smoothed rough edges. Enlightenment thinkers admired administrative rationality and religious tolerance. Figures like Voltaire emphasized what looked like secular, pragmatic tolerance in Mongol policies without tracing that tolerance back to an underlying calculus of extraction. Colonial-era commentators, in turn, saw the Mongols as precursors for imperial order admiring military competence while overlooking the ethical cost. That international framing helped transform a local origin story into a cross-cultural exemplar. In Europe and later in academic narratives, Mongol rule was often refracted through values the observers admired: statecraft, trade facilitation, religious leniency, creating a scaffolding that did not interrogate the building's foundations. When a story accords with contemporary values, it is surprisingly easy to turn omission into approval. The laundering process accelerated with the rise of nation-states and modern nationalism. For Mongolia, Genghis Khan became a symbol of unity and pride, a figure to rally citizens around in the 20th century. Statues went up, names went on airports. Tourism and branding packaged the founder into souvenirs and guidebooks. In a world where cultural capital can be monetized, the story grew handsomely beneficial. Jobs, museums, film contracts, and a global market eager for epic narratives. Hollywood and the entertainment industry further simplified and sweetened the founder's image. Films prefer tidy arcs. Wronged orphan becomes righteous conqueror. Complex motivations are sacrificed for coherence and profit. Scenes of brutality are either excised or stylized. The global audience consumes a dramatic hero rather than a ledger. Popular culture thus becomes a multiplier, spreading the sanitized version faster and making it more familiar than the archival records. At a quieter level, the Academy participated in the reframing, not always out of malice, but often out of selective emphasis. Scholars who study the Mongol state's innovations in communication, logistics, and tacit tolerance produce influential narratives. Those studies are valuable. They deserve reading. But emphasis matters. When scholarship highlights administrative novelty without equal attention to its murderous applications, it contributes to the lingering myth. The mechanics of propaganda were both active and passive. Active measures included commissioned texts, official patronage of arts that celebrated the founder, and the selective preservation. The founder's administrative practices contributed globally to trade and communication. But those contributions were forged with human lives as raw material. The dilemma facing anyone who studies such a figure is not how to choose sides. It is how to hold both truths in view. That some institutions created under violent conditions later produced benefits for distant peoples, and that those benefits were not free. They were paid for with disappearance and dispossession. Here is a final, arresting paradox. The very qualities that make Genghis Khan attractive to modern narratives, discipline, innovation, and apparent openness to useful outsiders, are the same qualities that made his regime efficient at killing. Efficiency has two faces. The myth makers chose to highlight the one that fits national pride, intellectual admiration, or commerce. The ledger kept the other. So what then? After decades of polished histories and romanticized films, the task is to assemble a portrait that keeps the ledger visible without flattening complexity. That takes work. Dusty archives, pollen cores, careful reading of Persian laments and Chinese court complaints, and a willingness to hold discomfort. It also takes cultural courage, the readiness to accept that national heroes can be both architects of order and instruments of systematic violence. After the myth has been dismantled, what remains is neither binary saint nor simple monster. It is a man and a system, and a story about how power rewrites itself into legitimacy. The viewer should leave this part aware that history is not merely uncovered, it is often manufactured. The next stage is to attempt a reconstruction, a plausible, uncomfortable portrait that refuses to evade the ledger or the statues. When the camera pulls back from the monuments and the edited chronicles, what do we finally see? Not only bones and ledgers, but the shadow the ledger casts on the present. Institutions, metaphors, and doctrines that keep turning efficiency into virtue. That is where the investigation must go next. When the polished plaster of myth is chipped away, what remains is neither saint nor cartoon villain. What remains is a figure whose contradictions map cleanly onto the institutions he built. A man who invented efficiency for war, administration, and, disturbingly, for death. This is the portrait the sources invite, and the evidence allows a Genghis Khan who was human, strategic, and morally obtuse in a way that modern systems would recognize. Start with character. The myth tells you a rags-to-riches hero, a tribal orphan who became a just ruler. The records, when read without editorial kindness, present a more complicated combination of traits. He was charismatic, yes. He could inspire loyalty and fear in equal measure. He was decisive, often ruthless in the moment, and extraordinarily adaptive. He absorbed innovation's siegecraft from Chinese engineers, administration from Persian scribes, diplomatic practice from sedentary courts, but he did so in an instrumental way. Everything was evaluated on a single metric. Did it increase control and reduce future friction? That single metric, pursued without moral calculus, is the core of the honest portrait. Next, goals. The conventional textbook answers are familiar. Unification of steppe tribes, creation of order, facilitation of trade. Those are not false, but they are partial. For Khan, unification served power consolidation, trade served revenue and intelligence, order served predictability of resource flows. He was less interested in an abstract ideal of civilization than in a stable, extractable base. Where the schoolbook praises meritocracy, the more accurate reading is that merit was a tool. Competence was rewarded when it increased the machine's reach. It could be discarded when it threatened control. Third axis, methods. Here the darkness consolidates into pattern. Khan treated politics like logistics. He counted people, not as souls, but as units with utility values, potential tax revenue, military recruits, artisans whose skills could be redistributed, or liabilities that might foment rebellion. He invented or perfected operational habits that look very modern. Census taking, forced relocation, selective assimilation. Those habits had a veneer of administrative rationality, but applied without humane constraints, they became mechanisms of depopulation. Consider the example of population transfer. On paper, moving a master artisan from one city to another reads like efficient redistribution of skills. In practice, it severed communities of memory. It erased elite networks that could coordinate resistance. It hollowed out cultural continuity. The policy produced immediate short-term gains, skilled labor to serve imperial projects, and long-term costs in violence and cultural destruction that were, to Khan's calculus, acceptable or irrelevant. Fourth axis, impact. He did not merely win battles. He changed the social fabric of entire regions. When elites vanished, when irrigation systems were deliberately broken, when skilled hands were conscripted and shipped away, the slow work of rebuilding cities and institutions became almost impossible. Some regions rebounded in decades. Others remained depopulated for generations. The result was a geopolitics of gaps, zones of vacuum that allowed the Mongol state to plant administrative nodes where none had existed before, then fill them with new populations partially loyal and entirely dependent on imperial structures. This portrait forces us to confront the moral engine behind effective governance. Khan's efficiency neutralized resistance not by argument but by negation. His laws, his relay posts, and his passports, all mechanisms widely admired by historians of communication and trade, sat on top of a ledger that included systematic erasure. The paradox is sharpest here. Efficiency created prosperity for some at the cost of annihilation for many. Now, the human contradictions. He could show clemency where it suited him. Cities that surrendered intact often retained their lives and some institutions. He adopted foreign experts into his court and tolerated diverse faiths. Yet contrition, empathy, or the restraint of moral law did not reliably shape his decisions. Mercy was a policy instrument rather than a principle. That is what makes the portrait unsettling. Kindness existed, but it was conditional, contingent, a variable in a strategic equation rather than a compass. Where the evidence becomes murky, the narrator must hold a cautious tone. Some claims quotas assigned to soldiers, the exact numbers of deaths in specific campaigns, the frequency of river diversion as a tactic are debated among specialists. Sources often carry bias. Persian chroniclers wrote from traumatized memory. Chinese records sometimes blurred official praise and complaint, and later Mongol histories were consciously promotional. Still, patterns converge. Independent accounts from different cultural zones point to a consistent methodology: terror as deterrent, transplantation as control, cataloging as governance. When multiple sources, archaeological layers, and environmental proxies, pollen records that show reforestation, sediment layers showing sudden drops in agricultural markers all point in the same direction, the reconstruction gains weight. A sober reconstruction must also separate what is likely from what remains contested. It is likely that forced relocations and skilled labor extractions were systemic. It is probable that routinized mass executions occurred during specific campaigns. It is less certain, though plausible, that all campaigns followed identical protocols in every theater. Regional commanders had latitude. Local politics, geography, and logistics influenced execution. The overall method, however, to normalize population control as an instrument of statecraft seems evident. At the level of symbolism, Khan was equally cunning. He knew how to write his image. Monumental acts, the declaration of law, the presentation of merit-based promotions, the integration of merchants into relay systems were staged to produce narratives. These narratives were then amplified by allies, intermediaries, and, importantly, by the survivors who found bargaining space in a world reshaped by Mongol power. Those who adapted or benefited had an interest in promoting the vision of a unifier who brought order, not a bureaucrat who optimized death. That ambiguity is central to the honest portrait. Genghis Khan was not simply the machinery of rule, once optimized, outlives its maker and keeps functioning long after ideologies are rebranded and monuments polished. And that persistent machinery is a direct inheritance of the leader we have reconstructed. The question that follows is not only who he was, but how the world learned to forget the ledger beneath the statue. The next section turns outward from him to the world he reshaped, and how that world continues to feel the pressure of his methods. The echoes of a leader's choices do not fade in neat chronological order. They ricochet through institutions, vocabulary, and habits of governance. To see the hidden legacy, look at three planes where his imprint is still legible: political structures, ideological language, and cultural industries. Each plane reveals a different mechanism by which memory was cleaned and meaning redistributed. Politically, the most durable inheritance was procedural. Genghis Khan elevated certain administrative practices from expedients into templates. Relay stations and passport systems that once moved couriers and merchants efficiently became instruments of central control. Census techniques originally used to identify taxable populations were adapted into tools of surveillance. Where central authorities could track people, they could tax, conscript, and, when considered necessary, remove. This procedural legacy had real geopolitical consequences. Empires that followed found it easier to imagine governance as data management. The logic is technocratic. Scale requires categories. Categories require classification of people by role and risk. Over time, the classification system becomes a moral shorthand. Loyal versus seditious, useful versus redundant, become cushions for decisions that inflict human cost. Modern states that bureaucratize population movements, resettlements, internments, forced labor echo those distant precedents even when their ideologies differ. The religious and ideological plane is subtler. Khan's famous tolerance has often been cited as evidence of an enlightened policy, a prince who permitted faiths to coexist. The honest reading is more instrumental. Religions were useful social technologies. They disciplined populations, provided networks for trade and charity, and offered languages of legitimacy. Allowing religious plurality reduced friction with conquered elites and supplied a vocabulary the state could reuse. Over generations, that instrumentality was reframed by later chroniclers as magnanimity. What started as pragmatic management became moralized memory. This reframing serves two functions. First, it decorates conquest with benevolence, making it easier for successor regimes to claim continuity with a wise founder. Second, it fosters a mental shortcut among observers. Tolerance means moral superiority, which distracts from how that tolerance was operationalized. The gap between policy motive and moral impression is a classic effect of myth-making. It is why phrases like Pax Mongolica sound reassuring. The Pax exists. The ledger of what purchased the peace is usually missing from postcards. Cultural industries, films, novels, museums, heritage tourism are the third and perhaps most visible plane. Where earlier generations carved histories into chronicles, modern industries package narratives into consumable goods. A cinematic trailer can do in 2 minutes what a court scribe took pages to shape: a tidy origin story. Visual culture prefers archetypes: the noble savage, the plucky underdog, the tough but fair ruler. These archetypes sell. They map to national narratives, to promotional campaigns, and to merchandise. The result is not only a selective memory, but a profitable one. Consider the anatomy of a popular film. It begins with personal hardship, escalates to sympathetic violence, justifies conquest as necessary, and ends with the protagonist as a figure of unity. Scenes of bureaucratic cruelty, of demographic engineering, are either excised or rendered inscrutable. Studio logic creates a marketable founder. Excavation of ledgers does not. The consequence is that millions of people learn the founder through stylized images, not archival records. The founder becomes a brand. Beyond image, there are tangible policy echoes today. Military doctrines that prize shock and demoralization echo the psychological methods used by Khan's armies. Overwhelm, symbolic destruction, and limited mercy to encourage surrender. When modern strategists debate shock and awe, or decapitation strikes, they are reenacting the moral logic of rapid, demonstrative force designed to produce compliance. The ethical questions about such tactics are modern. Their lineage, in part, is not. Another field where this legacy is surprising is environmental history. The demographic shocks of the Mongol period are among the rare cases where human violence left a detectable mark on the biosphere. Pollen cores and dendrochronological records show reforestation in areas where fields were abandoned. Some paleoclimatologists have argued that the loss of agricultural activity temporarily reduced carbon emissions enough to influence temperature trends. The idea is provocative. Human political violence contributed to planetary climate variability centuries before industry. If true in magnitude, it forces uncomfortable recognition that governance decisions can alter ecological baselines. All of this ties into a psychological legacy, the normalization of necessary brutality. When elites present difficult policies as regrettable but unavoidable, they borrow from the same rhetorical toolkit that protected Genghis Khan and his successors. The structure is familiar. Emphasize the goal, minimize the ledger. We faced an existential threat. The official tone says harsh measures were needed. That logic makes it easier to accept trade-offs between security and rights. It is a cognitive shortcut that often benefits rulers more than the ruled. There are also economic residues. The Silk Road revival under Mongol rule created networks that benefited merchants across Eurasia. Those gains are real. But the institutional scaffolding that allowed long-distance trade relay posts, tariff systems, legal protections for merchants often rested on an underlying model of coercive order. In other words, transcontinental commerce did not flourish in a vacuum. It grew where coercion reduced the costs of banditry and competition. The gains for merchants were thus partly purchased at the expense of populations who had been displaced or eliminated. Modern celebrations of globalized trade rarely acknowledge those implicit earlier bargains. Culturally, the most insidious legacy may be the ease with which a complex human life is flattened into a symbol. Statues, place names, and brand imagery harden a person into a univocal sign. Once that sign circulates widely, it becomes a cognitive lens through which policy choices and contemporary leaders are interpreted. A politician described as strong as X imports not only the image of prowess, but all the moral ambiguities attached. The shorthand makes debate cruder. Complicated histories become endorsements for simple strategies. What to do with that knowledge? The first step is awareness. Noticing when a historical figure functions as metaphor and asking what led to that metaphor's dominance. The second step is reclamation, bringing the ledger back into public conversation. Museums can display both trophies and tax rolls. Schools can teach institutional histories alongside heroic narratives. Filmmakers can depict consequence as well as spectacle. These are modest prescriptions, but they matter because myth-making thrives in vacuums where inconvenient paperwork is absent. Finally, there is a personal, civic implication. When you hear a leader praised for being harsh but effective, ask whose ledger is being hidden. When a textbook celebrates governance innovations, press to know on what body's innovation was exercised. The past is not merely a series of facts to be accepted. It is a set of choices whose echoes shape the present. Recognizing that makes the next question urgent. If a founder's dark methods were cleaned and sold back to us as virtue, what else has been polished away? The answer is not comforting, and that is precisely why this chapter matters. The final section will not tidy the portrait to a moral simpleton. It will leave a question that should unsettle all of us. We began with an image designed to shock, a man counting bodies like ledgers. We traced the comfortable